Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. It is Sunday, week 23 of our study of the book of Genesis. Let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll dive in. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for today, for this time and place, for this body of believers. Father, for your word, for this record we have of how you have met your people, how you've interacted. And Father, the variety of people that you've dealt with, and the hints, the messages, the notes that you've left us to help us recognize you, to seek you, to find you, to get to know you better. Father, I ask that you just open your word up to us today, and that you guide us through it and illuminate both who you are and who you'd like us to be. And give us more than just knowledge, give us understanding, give us wisdom. And Father, just be welcome here to interact with us, your children. And Father, we thank you so much and give you all honor, all glory, and all praise in Jesus' name. Amen. So, week 23, again, focusing on the book of Genesis in looking for the God of love from the beginning. So we'll be looking for the way that God interacts, the things that he praises in his people, the things he puts up with in his people. So this is screen one of where we were and what we did. Goes through week 21, which I thought I moved, but I apparently did not. Or okay, apparently I copied instead of cut. So week 21 and week 22. But then we will do a quick review if the button will work. Thank you. Week 22, we did 35, 21 on, finished that one up. And basically we had like a little blurb where Reuben had been with Jacob's concubine. It's like one little passage like here. Reuben did this awful thing, and then they kind of moved on. The majority of the text at that point was about Jacob and Esau burying Isaac, who died at 180 years old, which is, again, fascinating because like he gave that blessing 80 years before, thinking I'm at the end of my life. You never know. And then Esau leaves, goes on and establishes himself over in the land called Edom, which is called Edom because Esau was called Edom. Edom meaning red, going back to the red lentil stew, the red stew. Then the chapter 36 was the genealogies, and I stumbled over people's names felt like 20 minutes. Again, the emphasis there being just one, recognizing the meticulous nature of the way they kept track of who they were and who they weren't. Those who were of the line that was not selected by God to be of the covenant, the Messianic covenant ultimately. And those who were, it was very clear who they were and where they were, and that was separate from God's chosen people. Isaac to Jacob, and then Jacob to his 12 sons. Then we went into chapter 37 and started off with Joseph. I mean, the focus of the story really turns in on, again, one son out of choices. But we start to follow. Joseph has a pretty amazing call. He's got these dreams. And he's also he carries favor. We know later on in the story that God specifically gives his favor to Joseph, so Joseph does well where he's at. But it's like that's part of the makeup of Joseph. He's got his father's favor. And that isn't handled very well. There's a lot of... you could say, well, if Jacob had handled things differently, then Joseph's life would have been different. But maybe this was God's plan. And ultimately, I think what happened here is God had a plan and had a place where Joseph was going to be. And despite the mishandling of his raising that Jacob did, God got him there. Now, if Jacob had done better, Joseph would have had to go through a different journey to learn the same things, to end up in the same place. So this is one of those things where God has a plan, God has a will. He's just good enough to make it happen no matter how we mess it up. provided our focus and our goal is always him. But in this case, Jacob favored him, really spoiled him. He gave him this coat of many colors, and I did some more research on this, and there's a lot of writing on the word that is translated as coat or many-colored tunic or many-colored cloak. The word that they use for cloak or coat or whatever is always translated as tunic everywhere else that is used in the Bible. And it's the same word that is used to describe the tunic for the priests. And again, it was the tunic that had the sash wrapped around it and then the robe put on top of it. It's also the word that is translated as multicolored. You would not believe how much debate there is on this. I mean, you can actually search this on Google and find lots of articles on people arguing back and forth. Is it multicolored? Is it patched? Is it striped? Does it just refer to a fine quality? And then it's also a word that means palm or foot length or full length. Ultimately, though, what it means is this is a fine garment. It's not outerwear. It's not underwear, but it is the main tunic. It is a garment of someone who is not a laborer. I mean, what it really comes down to is it's usually linen, or at best or at worst, like a very fine wool. Generally, it's decorative or ornamental. Some people actually translate it as silk. You see the same word used when they talk about women later on wearing very fine garments or ornamental things. But like ultimately, what it really gets down to, and I guess that this isn't all that significant. It's just I just find it interesting that even if you go into the Jewish text and when they'll illustrate it, it's always this overcloak or coat that he wore on top of everything else, and sometimes they'll even wear like a short tunic underneath this really fancy robe, but the word is always translated as meaning the garment they would wear under that robe. But the big thing really comes down to, and this is the one that gets emphasized by most of the articles I was reading, is it's very clearly this is the clothes of someone who works inside and is not someone who works outdoors and works as a laborer. This is a person who has a desk job, so to speak. It basically marked him as one who isn't going to have to do the same kind of work as his brothers. It is definitely a status symbol. And he's nearly the baby of the family. So his brothers who have been working in the field and have been doing this and working hard, and here is nearly the youngest of the bunch, and he's given this robe and kind of put in charge and put over them. And like, it's really no wonder that they didn't like him. And he's favored so much that he doesn't really have much class in talking to them. And we see that with the dreams. First he has the dream, which he brags to his brothers, like we're all harvesting, and my bundle of wheat stood up, and all of yours came around and bowed down to it, and that made him real popular. And if that wasn't enough, then he turns around and has another dream. Now the dreams are God's, but what he did with them, said that the stars and the sun and moon all bowed down to him, and his dad's like, "What are you talking about? He's like, are your mother and I going to bow down to you too?" And but then he's like, kind of weighing that out.
Yeah, sometimes God gives you a word personally.
Yes.
And you may not be supposed to share it.
And or frequently, God will tell you things that you're supposed to ponder and have in mind. It's a signpost he's giving you, not something to go throw around. Certainly not something to brag about, because, if God said, "I'm going to elevate you," what are you bragging about? He's the one that's going to do the elevating. But Joseph's 17 at this point. There's enough said right there. So we'll go ahead and move into the text for today. Again, the question is, where is the God I love in this passage? Why did he preserve this in his word? And how does this passage apply to my life? And that will take us to chapter 37, verse 18. Almost did it. So he has been sent by his father to go check on his brothers who are out in the land of Shechem, pasturing the flock. and he goes out there, puts his robe on, and heads out there. What's really interesting to me is he heads out there in his fine tunic. I mean, he didn't put on traveling clothes. He went out in that same tunic, that same garment that says, "I'm somebody." Anyway, when they saw him from a distance, so he goes and he looks for them in Shechem. They're not there. Meets a guy out there. He says they went on to Dothan. And so he continued on. And as he's traveling in his bright clothing, when they saw him from a distance, and before he came closer to them, this is his brothers, they plotted against him to put him to death. It's really kind of interesting how often, I mean, we got Jacob and Esau's wanting Jacob dead, and now we've got Joseph, who is the favored one, and his brothers want to put him to death. There is actually a recurring theme here of brothers, animosity between brothers, and God doing a work, and before that work is fully complete, there's at least an attempt and a work toward reconciling the brothers' relationship. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let's kill him, and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say a vicious animal devoured him. Then we will see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands by saying, "Let's not take his life." Then Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, so that later he might rescue him out of their hands to return him to his father." And pause right there. So we've got let me just scroll all the way up to the beginning of this chapter. Actually, it's the beginning of the last chapter. We have one little thing about Reuben, and it's bad judgment. It's an inappropriate relationship with his father's concubine. And then we see Reuben stepping out here to protect Joseph. He's the only one of the 10. I don't know. There's no indication that Benjamin is out amongst them at this point. In fact, based on how Joseph responded to Benjamin later on, it seems pretty clear that he wasn't. But here he goes. I mean, of them, he's got the most shameful thing written about him, other than maybe Simeon and Levi. And here he is stepping in and protecting him. Like, let's not kill him, with the intention to come back and rescue him. So it came about, when Joseph reached his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the multicolored tunic that was on him, like he came dressed for a party or something. And they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty, without any water in it. Now, yeah, we'll just keep going. Then they sat down to eat a meal. I mean, this is just, first it's like, let's just kill him. Let's just murder him, and then they'll see what happens with his dreams. Then they throw him in a pit. They strip him, throw him in the pit, and sit down and have a meal. And like, things did not go the way Joseph expected. I mean, that is not the greeting he was expecting. I just can't even, this is just this picture, like this pit. These pits were like cisterns for gathering water, for collecting water. And they just threw him in there and then sat down and started eating. Just had a little barbecue going on. Well, Joseph's going like, "Hey!" Like this fun joke, fun, really funny. Although it's just as likely, "I'll tell Dad on you." But then they sat down to eat a meal. But as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying labdanum, resin, I have no idea what that is, balsam, and myrrh, on their way to bring them down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, this is one of those moments where you realize just because somebody's the patriarch of a line that good things are come from does not mean that they're all that awesome. Judah says to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." Let's not kill him, just to sell him into slavery. And his brothers listened to him.
It's an upgrade.
Yeah, you're dead to property. Yeah.
Pretty important step, actually.
It's significant. Not dead is definitely better.
But everything else that happened from that.
Oh, absolutely. This is definitely definitely God's hand. Like there's no doubt, but
Yeah, I feel like he really needed, a lesson in being a little bit more, what's the word for that?
humble,
Yeah.
personable. It's like a number of things. Like Joseph's life is about to change drastically. But this is actually an interesting. It just occurred to me. This is an interesting lesson on internet trolling. There's a lot of people who get used to being able to say whatever they're thinking or however they think it or whatever argument they want to, because what are they going to do to me? I mean, I'm typing it out. There's no consequences. And you see stuff going on where those same people have not learned that you can only push people so far, and they're shocked when people react. And I think Joseph kind of got a taste of this, where he's been protected by his father all this time, and now he's out there, and you learn that you can only treat people badly so long before there's just so much they can put up with. Now that's not excusing what they did, but this is a healthy lesson for someone, provided you survive it. It's one of the things I've told my boys, like as they were growing up. It's like, listen, I'm your dad and I love you, but so you treat somebody that doesn't love you like that, and they're not going to treat you as nicely as I do. You've got to understand that people won't put up with this. And someone needed to tell Joseph this, and apparently this is it. So they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And then some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him out and lifted Joseph up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. So they brought Joseph into Egypt. Now Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. So he tore his garments. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go?" So they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in the blood. And they sent the multicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not." Then he examined it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A vicious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." So Jacob tore his clothes and put on a sackcloth undergarment over his waist and mourned for his son for many days. Then all his sons and all his daughters got up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "Surely I will go down into Sheol in mourning for my son." So his father wept for him. I'm going to pause before we wrap this up. It's interesting as we start putting together what's actually said. We know that Reuben has left at some point, so he wasn't part of this decision to sell Joseph. But also the idea that he went to the pit and then came back to his brothers. It kind of gives me this image that this pit was actually more distant, some distance away from where they were eating. They just dropped him in and they went off to go eat. They weren't right there by it, but so they had to go. They saw the Ishmaelites, then they went and got him. They dragged him out of the pit and then sold him. Then went back to where they were, possibly eating. We don't know where Reuben went, don't know why. All we know is that he came back, and he may have come back by way of the pit to kind of get Joseph out before the brothers knew what was going on. Don't know. But he goes there, and Joseph's gone, and he's panicking. He's like, he might even be thinking maybe they killed him anyway. But he goes back to them, and so they come up with this plan. It's like, well, we talked about this whole bit before. Well, let's go ahead and do the part where we'll explain why he's missing, but we'll say some vicious animal killed him.
Why do you think he says that? Where am I to go?
It's kind of one of those things like, what am I supposed to do now?
Right.
Or he's also the eldest.
Right, so he's going to have to explain.
So he's where have I? How can I go home if he's missing? If he's gone, there's no explanation. Yes, and so they bring this back to Jacob, and Jacob is brokenhearted. I mean, absolutely, and which is understandable. However, it was to the point that, I mean, he's not just saying not just saying brokenhearted. And this is a time when death was even more common than now. Well, they didn't have medical facilities. The death in child birth was extremely common. But I mean, the loss of a son is a big deal. But this is he's making as I'm going to go to my grave mourning for my son. I'm going to mourn for this forever, for the rest of my life. It said that his sons and his daughters, like all his sons and daughters, got up to comfort him. Now unless there's like some genealogy that they haven't listed, which would be incredibly unlikely, I think we're looking here at the sons and daughters are the sons and daughters of Israel, or the people, the encampment. Basically, everybody under him, all of his people had come to try to comfort him, and he would not be comforted anymore. And in fact, this goes on through the story where he's still mourning years later, mourning the death of Joseph.
And like you said, death was prolific, and so people were used to it. So maybe it wasn't as big of a deal, and they were accustomed to people dying, young and whatever. But here, he took it deeply. In fact, it affected him so deeply that this will show up later on in the story and the narrative. In fact, we'll get to it a little bit in just a moment. But meanwhile, the Midianites, or the Ishmaelites, sold him into Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. We're going to get into more about that, but that word bodyguard is an interesting word. It doesn't actually translate to bodyguard, although it's a reasonable choice. He's the officer or the captain. He's like head of security for the palace. Because the word bodyguard can actually be translated as executioner or cook or just guardsman or whatever. So Potiphar is the official who is over the security. So he would be over just the regular guards, the regular security, the palace guards, the palace prison. He would have been in charge of people, say like the cook or the cupbearer or the head baker, who those show up later on. That all will play into the way the story goes when we get to that point. But one of the things that's difficult about trying to teach this as a narrative is that they jump around. I mean, like, we got everything like geared up, like, let's follow Joseph, like, things are going to get interesting. But before we do that, we'll switch over to Judah and Tamar. I was all geared up when I was doing the prep for this, actually last week, because I thought we'd get further than we did. But and then I'm ready to go on to the whole Potiphar thing, as I was just ready to do, and then realized, okay, we got this story. You can imagine I never taught this one to the middle schoolers. In fact, generally when I taught Genesis in the past, it was always from person to person. I didn't do it verse by verse. I would go from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. Jacob pretty much went straight to Joseph and left out Judah and Tamar and anything like it. Like, Lot didn't get a whole lot of advertisement either. But there are some interesting things in this, and we're not going to skip any verses anyhow. So, pause on the Joseph thing is like to be continued. We'll come over to this part of the story. It is significant because this is going to go again. Judah is the head of the line for eventually that the Messiah is going to come through. And there's some other things in here. And it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite. We can kind of assume that Judah left because dad was a little bit difficult to be around. And it was Judah's idea to sell Joseph. And this is conjecture, but Judah came up with the idea. Their dad is absolutely miserable. I mean, he is despondent. And so, imagine there were some brothers saying, well, it was his idea.
Yeah, not to dad. But so Judah goes and visits a friend, a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. Now this is interesting. Okay, and he took her as a wife and had relations with her, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. Just pause right there. We don't ever find out the name of the wife. He met a daughter of a certain Canaanite named Shua, so we know the mother's name. Or maybe it's the father, I don't even know. But the wife never gets a name here. And that's interesting. All
all the wife gets is that she was the daughter of a Canaanite. Now, there's some conjecture that goes that people try to come up with reasons why the rest of this story plays out, based on the fact that she's specifically listed as a Canaanite. And there is the curse on the Canaanites, and there's the land of the Canaanites and problems with them. We may address that. So she gave birth to a son, and she named him Then she conceived again and gave birth to a son, and she named him Onan. She gave birth to yet another son, and she named him Shelah. And it was at Chezib that she gave birth to him. No idea why that's significant, but there you have it. They kept records. They didn't list the mom's name, but we know where the son was born. Anyway, and then here's another thing, just side thing. If you go to research some of this stuff, I like to go back to some of the Jewish writings and the Jewish teachings. Their teachings, they have a lot more information, but if you're trying to get like something this literally accurate, it's difficult because they have so many traditions. They've got their you've got the Torah, and then they've got the Talmud, and the Talmud is like an encyclopedic collection of teachings and traditions based on the scripture. So you try to find this, and what you get is scholar after scholar after scholar talking about how it could be this, and it's almost like case law. It's like the law has been interpreted certain ways, and so there's traditionally what's accepted and what's not. You see where the Pharisees, how they got where they were, where their traditions had become more important than the law. And going through and trying to research some of this stuff through the Jewish teachings, you start to see how muddy the waters get. There's some good stuff in there, obviously, but it's like trying to sort through traditionally this or like, but anyway. So, sorry, that was a tangent.
As you were.
Yeah. Now, okay, Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Here's an interesting thing: there is the whole business of the Judah's wife being Canaanite. The Christ, the Messiah, is supposed to come through the line of Judah. So there's the whole line of reasoning that says that because she was a Canaanite, the Messiah couldn't come from that line. So we had to get rid of these half Canaanite sons. Problem is, where is Tamar from? We don't know where Tamar came from. It's not. Judah's wife was specifically listed as a Canaanite, and Tamar was not. But they live in Canaan. Where did he find Tamar? It's not like. So I don't know. There's some assumptions made there, and
Tamar's father is listed in there. Does it say
Tamar's
what genealogy he was from, or what? Is it
Tamar? I don't believe Tamar's father was. Judah took a wife for.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Judah's wife's parents or parent was mentioned, but Tamar is she's just here, and she gets a name. Judah's wife didn't get a name, but Tamar does. Also interesting because ultimately the line that the kings come through comes through Tamar, not this other wife. So she gets a name, the other one doesn't. But we don't know if she was Canaanite, if she wasn't. There are assumptions, but they go both ways. If you try to research it, you really can't find anything definitive. Anyway, his firstborn, has a wife. Her name is Tamar, but Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord took his life. Now, people look really deeply into the teachings, and again, there's that whole Canaanite thing. And there may be something there. But I think what ends up happening is you start looking so deeply into those causes and this outside plan that what the scripture actually says is Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord. And I think we can overcomplicate things. I feel like I have already today. he was evil in the sight of the Lord, so God killed him and he judged him for what he was and who he was and what he did. So the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Onan, have relations with your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her and raise up a child for your brother. Now, part of this, a widow's future is often dependent on her sons. I mean, this is her provision. So it'd be Er's family name would continue on, but also it's something to provide for Tamar. Tamar is taken into the house of Onan because he's the brother-in-law. She becomes a wife, but she's still the wife of so that the son that she would have through this would be one who would take care of her. It's taking care of her. It's a provision for her. Well, but it's also so that the brother's line would carry on. But there's a lot of responsibilities here, a lot of provision that is built into these relationships, provided everybody does what they're supposed to. Now we get to Onan. Now Onan knew that the child would not be his, so when he had relations with his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground so that he would not give a child to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. So, not going to get into the thing, but if you, on your own time, and not in this, but if you decide, ever look up the sin of Onan, there are whole teachings, like Christian religious teachings based on this concept, that their motivations were probably, I am going to get into it anyway. The sin of Onan was this. It was okay, and it wasn't just that he didn't give her a son. He could have refused to marry her. What he did was he took her as a wife and took advantages of the right of that relationship, but refused the responsibilities. He had a responsibility, a duty to provide an heir, but also somebody for Tamar. And he's basically like, I'm gonna have all the benefits without any of the responsibilities. I'm not gonna she's not gonna have a son by me. I'm not gonna do it. He was incredibly selfish here. So I mean, he had a duty, refused to do the duty, but he was trying to get all the benefits without any of the responsibility, and this is just evil. I mean, he's basically using Tamar. It's disgusting. It's incredibly displeasing to the Lord. So God got rid of him too.
So was it a tradition or was it a law?
It was a cultural norm. Later on, it becomes part of the law of Moses. It's included in there. It's one of the things that we have a hard time realizing is that there were laws and traditions and customs that were nearly law, but there were responsibilities. It's not like God suddenly waited till Moses showed up to tell people what he expected of them. I mean, we know as early as Cain and Abel that there was a right and a wrong way to do sacrifices. We know that Abraham knew a right and wrong way to do things. We know that Lot knew what was right and wrong. It was never written down, it was never codified, but what God expected was clear to these people. And again, we have Judah telling Onan, it's like, do your duty as a brother-in-law. This is your responsibility. But he wouldn't.
Because it was shameful for the woman to not have children.
Right, but also no provision for her, like her future and everything. Yes, sir.
How come Jacob didn't step in and say, you're only supposed to marry Jewish women? I mean, these guys knew a little bit, right? So
They knew some. I don't know how much of a custom that was, because they were still a fairly small people at that point. So, as far as Jewish or Israelites, right now the only Israelites are Jacob and his 12 sons and his daughter. So they pretty much had to marry outside of the, well, I want to say outside of the family, but outside the people, because the people didn't exist yet. All right. And while there was definitely a curse on Canaan, the son of Ham, there wasn't anything necessarily specific that said, don't marry among these. Now, we have the whole Esau thing, don't marry these Canaanite women. because they're driving everybody crazy. But there wasn't necessarily, except for that, there hasn't been a written instruction that says don't do this. Again, that's what one of the things is. People who are trying to say that this judgment of and Onan was based on the fact that they were related to a Canaanite, I don't think it really holds water, because there's no commandment that we see that says that it shouldn't, and what we do see is they were judged on their character and their behavior. Now later on it gets important, but that's codified. That's dealt with in the law that God gives through Moses. So. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he thought, "I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers." So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Now here's the interesting thing. So Judah's like, "I've got Tamar for died. I gave Tamar to Onan died." So, but instead of looking at or Onan as the problem, he's blaming Tamar. It's like, well, this woman's obviously bad luck. There are, this whole phase of Genesis is a warning to fathers to know your sons and to treat them equally, but to raise them right, or to do the best that you can to raise them right. There's whole stories of whole lessons on against favoritism, but also on knowing the character. I mean, clearly this is recorded. Anyway, Judah had a duty to provide her another husband through her sons, and he didn't do it. In fact, he even sent her away. So go live back with your father, which is, it's questionable on how right that was. I mean, like, she was still family. I mean, still refers to as his daughter-in-law. I mean, he had a responsibility, and he put that off. And so Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Now, after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, who doesn't get a name, the wife of Judah, died. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his... Okay, here's where things get really... went up to... help me, Jesus. like all these... Okay, like, this is a good point to stop. It's amazing what God puts up with. So when we start thinking, like, I'm too big a mess for God to whatever, no. God is standing with remarkably open arms to receive us. So, now after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died, and when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. You know, every time Hira gets involved in Judah's life, he makes some bad decisions. Married a wife that couldn't even be named, and now this. And Tamar was told, "Behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So she removed her widow's garments, and covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife. So a considerable time has happened, and she's still wearing widow's clothes. I mean, her life has basically been put on hold. She can't have a future because it's been denied her. When Judah saw her, he assumed she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here now, let me have relations with you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. So many things wrong with this story. And she said, "What will you give me that you may have relations with me?" He said, "Therefore, I will send you a young goat from the flock." Then she said, "Will you give a pledge until you send it?" He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" And she said, "Your seal and your cord, and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and had relations with her, and she conceived by him. And then she got up and departed, and removed her veil and put on her widow's garments. I tell you what, how any of this stuff didn't end up getting made into big theater is beyond me. Shakespeare didn't come up with anything this twisted. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the people of her place, saying, "Where is the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim?" But they said, "There has been no temple prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I did not find her. And furthermore, the people of the place said, there has been no temple prostitute here. Then Judah said, let her keep them, otherwise we will become a laughing stock. And after all, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her. It's interesting that he was more worried about fulfilling this obligation than he was the real obligation he had to Tamar. Now it was about 3 months later that Judah was informed, your daughter-in-law Tamar has prostituted herself, and behold, she is also pregnant by prostitution. Then Judah, righteous Judah, bring her out and have her burned. It was while she was being brought out. See, and he had no problem using a prostitute, but it was while she was being brought out that she sent word to her father-in-law, saying, I am pregnant by the man to whom these things belong. She also said, please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these. And Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. And he did not have relations with her again. So it's like, he's not going to compound. He's not taking her as a wife, but she lives, and he's taking care of her now. It came,
Convicted.
yes. And, all the other stuff up to this point, so you just shake your head. But then when the moment came and he's confronted with it, how does he act? He's like, she's more honorable than I am. I mean, I should have done this. I was wrong. And then he changes. And yes, everything up to this point is absolute insanity to me. But that moment where he says, I was wrong, and he makes it right and does right by her.
To me, it shows the value of a woman back then.
Oh, yes.
Not much, but it was short.
Well, here's the thing.
Long way.
It depends. Like, the value of the woman was very high, actually. But depending on the woman. Like, a woman of virtue who you knew is going to be faithful, you knew your sons were your sons. You knew that the line was like that, all of that. There's a reason that all that is so significant. I mean, look at how much emphasis they put on who's related to who and what the family line is and how important that is. The gatekeeper to that is a woman's virtue. So a temple prostitute, they not valued much more than a goat, apparently. But a virtuous woman in the family is priceless. In fact, as soon as he found out that she had been unfaithful, even though he was unfaithful first, it was a terrible thing, because now, I mean, you're potentially like messing up the entire the bloodline, the genealogy, the inheritance, everything. People look at this from a modern perspective, and they will frequently see it as looking rather prudish, which is a word that, but there was reasons behind it, but I mean, they were valued very highly, but they had very strict standards and reasons for those standards. But Judah ran face to face with his own hypocrisy in this, because he did not value her like he should have, put her in a bad spot, so she did something desperate. And when he went to judge her on that act, he realized that it was his fault. And so he took ownership of it. I'm going to try and wrap this up, because this is a terrible place to stop the story. It came about.
She had it pretty rough.
Yes, I mean, Tamar.
Experiences.
Oh man, 2 lousy husbands in a row, and then this. It came about at that time. She was giving birth, that behold, and this is another. There were twins in her womb. Moreover, it took place while she was giving birth, that one baby put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But it came about as he drew back his hand that, behold, his brother came out. Then she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. Well, So he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. Perez ends up being the line through which the Christ comes, the Messiah comes. Shelah does end up having family, but they go off, it's a lesser branch. And Zerah, and they're in there too, but if you go along and find the line of the kings, it comes from Perez. I am going to stop there. Let's just take a quick peek. Hey, we get to go back to Joseph, which has its own drama, but not like that. So,
I think a baby must have switched a friend.
yeah. I'm not even going to get into that. So, we've got Judah, who is the line that the Messiah comes through. And we got him also in this same bit. He's the one who... And okay, he's the one who came up with the plan to sell Joseph into slavery, which is interesting. It's totally wrong, but we have in that the plan that sets things in motion for Israel's ultimate salvation came from Judah. It was Judah's sin that God used for good, but also interestingly enough, that as Judah left the consequences of that and ends up making his own mess, he ends up still, through his sins, resulting in the line that ends up coming to get ultimately to the salvation of Israel and to the world. So we see repeatedly that God chooses the line, and it's not about the worth of the line, it's about the God who made the choice. Judah is not, he has a couple of good moments in the middle of all this, but it's not about how good Judah was. It's about the God chose. So God, despite Judah's mistakes, some of them blatant and deliberate, God still has his plan. He's going to make it happen. He's just really big. He can use whatever circumstances we've got to make his plan happen. And he'll do it through the tool he's chosen, even if the tool is greatly flawed. I personally find that incredibly encouraging. So we don't have a whole lot of God interacting except to kill off these worthless sons of Judah. That sounds like a mouthful, but we do see him cultivating his will in the midst of rebellion, hypocrisy, and poor choices. So that's an awesome God. We also see someone being confronted with his own hypocrisy and owning up to it. It's like, I was wrong, and then moving forward. And that's a big deal. We also see a lot of emphasis on right relationships between brothers. We also see that God did not abandon a widow. However people valued Tamar, who got to have a name, who ultimately ends up in the lineage of Christ, was not abandoned. Despite the fact that all her choices weren't necessarily the best, God used it and still took care of his own. So, on that note, I will let you all go and be encouraged. Don't be a hypocrite and do all these crazy things, but if you are, own up to it and just trust that God's big. He can handle it. We can't mess up his plans. So seek God. Be a good example. So if it's ever written down, it's not this.